I never imagined my wedding day would become the most traumatic moment of my life. As I stood there in my white dress, surrounded by flowers and the expectant faces of our guests, my world shattered in a matter of seconds. My mother-in-law's words still echo in my ears, her voice filled with venom as she stood up during that crucial moment. "The child she's carrying is not my son's." The church fell silent. 250 guests turned to stare at me, their expressions morphing from joy to shock, then to judgment. I felt my baby kick inside me, as if sensing my distress. Brandon, my fiancé, the man I'd loved for the past 5 years, looked at me with such betrayal in his eyes that my heart stopped beating for a moment. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Hillary Carter, and this is the story of how I lost everything, only to gain something far more precious than I could have ever imagined. I met Brandon Richmond at a charity gala in Boston. He was everything I'd ever dreamed of. Successful, kind, and with a smile that could light up any room. Our courtship was like a fairy tale, filled with romantic dinners, surprise weekend getaways, and countless moments of pure joy. Even his mother, Margaret, seemed to adore me at first. She would invite me for tea, share family recipes, and tell me stories about Brandon's childhood. I thought I'd hit the jackpot with my future mother-in-law. Everything changed when I discovered I was pregnant. Brandon was overjoyed, spinning me around in our kitchen when I showed him the positive test. We decided to move our wedding date closer, wanting our child to be born into a traditional family setting. That's when I started noticing subtle changes in Margaret's behavior. She began asking strange questions about my past relationships. Her warm smiles turned forced, and her eyes would linger on my growing belly with an expression I couldn't quite read. I brushed it off as pre-wedding jitters, or perhaps some anxiety about becoming a grandmother. How wrong I was. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations. Margaret insisted on being involved in every detail, from the flower arrangements to the seating chart. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. She was gathering information, learning every detail of our celebration to orchestrate her cruel plan perfectly. The morning of my wedding dawned bright and clear. My bridesmaids helped me into my dress, specially altered to accommodate my 4-month baby bump. My father wiped away tears when he saw me, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. I remember touching my belly, whispering a promise to my unborn child that they would grow up surrounded by love. As I walked down the aisle, my eyes locked with Brandon's. He looked so handsome in his tuxedo, and the love in his eyes made me feel like the luckiest woman alive. The church was decorated with white roses and lilies, Margaret's choices. She sat in the front row, wearing a pale blue dress and a strange, almost triumphant smile. The ceremony proceeded normally until the moment when the priest asked if anyone had any reason why we shouldn't be married. That's when Margaret stood up, her voice cutting through the sacred silence like a knife. "I have proof," she announced, pulling out a manila envelope. "I have proof that the child my son thinks is his was conceived with another man. Hillary has been lying to all of us." The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. Margaret walked to the altar, handing Brandon what she claimed were medical records and photos. I tried to speak, to defend myself, but my voice seemed trapped in my throat. The documents looked official, complete with medical letterheads and timestamps. Even I felt a moment of doubt, wondering how she had managed to create such convincing evidence. Brandon's face turned pale as he looked through the papers. When he finally looked at me, I didn't recognize the man I loved. His eyes were cold, distant, filled with a mixture of hurt and disgust that broke something inside me. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No!" I finally found my voice. "Brandon, you know me. You know I would never—" But Margaret interrupted, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The dates don't lie, dear. The conception had to have happened during that business trip you took to New York. Remember? When Brandon was in London?" I stood there, my hand protectively covering my belly, as my perfect world crumbled around me. The whispers from the guests grew louder, becoming a wave of judgment that threatened to drown me. My bridesmaid stood frozen, unsure whether to defend me or step away from the scandal. That's when Brandon made his choice. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the altar. His best man followed, then his groomsmen. One by one, people began to leave the church, some throwing pitying glances my way, others avoiding eye contact completely. As my father tried to reach me through the chaos, I caught sight of Margaret's reflection in one of the church's ornate mirrors. For just a moment, I saw something in her eyes that would haunt me for years to come. Satisfaction. Pure, unfiltered satisfaction at having successfully destroyed her son's happiness along with mine. I never made it back down that aisle. Instead, I fled through a side door, still in my wedding dress, my veil catching on the rose bushes as I ran. My father found me hours later, huddled in our family's garden, my white dress stained with grass and tears. That night, as I lay in my childhood bedroom, I made 2 promises. First, to my unborn child, that I would give them all the love in the world, regardless of what anyone else believed. And second, to myself, that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. The weeks following what should have been my wedding day passed in a fog of pain and disbelief. Every morning, I'd wake up hoping it had all been a terrible nightmare, only to feel my growing belly and remember that this was my new reality. The local newspapers had a field day with the scandal. The abandoned pregnant bride, the wealthy family's shame, the dramatic scene at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I couldn't even go grocery shopping without feeling the weight of whispers and stares. My father, bless his heart, transformed our home office into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow that reminded me of spring mornings. "Yellow is for hope," he'd say, carefully drawing little birds on the walls. My mother spent hours knitting baby clothes, filling the quiet moments with gentle conversation about anything except that day. They were my anchors in the storm, but even they couldn't fully shield me from the darkness that threatened to consume me. The hardest part wasn't the gossip or the pitying looks. It was the silence from Brandon. No calls, no messages, not even a formal cancellation of our shared apartment lease. His silence spoke volumes about how completely he believed his mother's lies. I tried reaching out once, sending a carefully worded email explaining that I was willing to take a paternity test, that I wanted to understand how Margaret had fabricated those documents. The email bounced back. He'd blocked my address. One particularly difficult evening, as I sat sorting through what should have been our wedding gifts to return them, I found myself holding the silver picture frame Margaret had given us at our engagement party. The irony wasn't lost on me. It was engraved with the words, "Forever begins today." In a rare moment of anger, I hurled it against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces. That's when I felt it, my baby's first real kick. Not the subtle flutters I'd felt before, but a proper kick, as if saying, "Mom, I'm here. We're going to be okay." I placed my hand on my belly, tears streaming down my face, but for the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of despair. Something shifted inside me that moment. I got up from the floor, swept up the broken glass, and made a decision. I wouldn't let Margaret's cruelty define my child's life or mine. The next morning, I called my old boss at the marketing firm where I'd worked before getting engaged. Brandon had convinced me to quit, wanting me to focus on planning our wedding and eventually becoming a full-time mother. Now, that decision felt like just another way I'd let myself become vulnerable. "Hillary," Sandra, my former boss, said after listening to my situation, "we've missed you around here. As it happens, we're launching a new digital marketing division. How would you feel about heading it up?" I found myself choking back tears of gratitude. "But I'm 5 months pregnant," I admitted, expecting the offer to evaporate. "And some of our best ideas have come from sleep-deprived parents. When can you start?" That conversation marked the beginning of my resurrection. I threw myself into work, channeling my pain into creativity. My pregnancy became my strength rather than my shame. During client meetings, I'd rest my hand on my growing belly, drawing confidence from the little life that depended on me. The whispers at the office gradually changed from "poor thing" to "how does she do it all?" But life has a way of testing your strength just when you think you've found your footing. One rainy Tuesday, while leaving a client meeting, I quite literally ran into Margaret at the entrance of a cafe. She was having lunch with her friends, the same women who'd been at my bridal shower, cooing over registry gifts and playing silly games. The look of shock on her face quickly morphed into that same smug expression I remembered from the wedding. "Hillary, dear," she said, loud enough for her companions to hear. "You're looking, well." Her eyes lingered on my now obvious pregnancy. "I do hope you've figured out who the father is by now." I felt the old shame and hurt rising in my chest, threatening to choke me. But then my baby kicked again, as if on cue, and I found my voice. "I've always known who the father is, Margaret. What I haven't figured out is why you felt the need to destroy your son's happiness along with mine. But I suppose that's between you and your conscience." Her face paled slightly, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, perhaps? Before she could respond, I walked past her into the cafe, ordered my decaf latte, and left with my head held high. My hands were shaking, but I'd done it. I'd faced her without breaking down. That evening, I sat in the nursery, watching the sunset paint shadows across those yellow walls. My father's painted birds seemed to dance in the fading light. I opened my laptop and began typing. Not an email this time, but a journal. I needed to document everything. Not just for myself, but for my child. They deserved to know their story, the truth about where they came from, and how deeply they were loved from the very beginning. "Your grandmother thinks she's destroyed us," I wrote. "But she doesn't understand that love can't be destroyed by lies. It can only be transformed. And you, my little one, are the proof of that transformation." As I wrote, I felt my baby moving, almost as if they were responding to my words. I had no idea then how important this journal would become, or that years later, it would hold the key to unraveling Margaret's carefully constructed web of lies. But that night, it was simply my way of ensuring that our story wouldn't be lost in the chaos of other people's cruelty. The next morning, I made another decision. I started taking photographs of my growing belly, of the nursery, of every ultrasound appointment. I created a timeline, gathering evidence of my own. Not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I refused to let Margaret's version of events be the only record of this time in our lives. As my due date approached, I found myself wondering less and less about Brandon. The man who could walk away without even hearing my side of the story, who could believe the worst about me so easily, wasn't the man I thought I'd known. The real betrayal, I realized, wasn't just Margaret's lies. It was his willingness to accept them without question. The old Hillary died on that altar, but the woman who emerged from those ashes was stronger than I ever imagined I could be. My baby and I were writing our own story now, one that didn't need validation from the Richmonds or anyone else. What I didn't know then was that this was just the beginning of a journey that would lead to an even more extraordinary chapter in our lives. My son was born on a crisp October morning, just as the sun was rising over Boston Harbor. The moment I heard his first cry, everything else faded away. The pain of the past months, the betrayal, the gossip, none of it mattered anymore. Looking into his perfect face, I saw my future staring back at me with Brandon's eyes. I named him Alexander, after my father, Alexander James Carter. Not Richmond. That bridge had been burned on what should have been my wedding day. As I held him in my arms that first morning, I whispered promises into his tiny ear. I would protect him, not just from physical harm, but from the toxic legacy of lies that had marked his entrance into this world. The nurses kept commenting on how much he looked like his father. Each comment was like a small knife to my heart, but they weren't wrong. Alexander was Brandon's mirror image, from his dark curls to the slight dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of night feedings, I would study his little face and wonder if Brandon ever thought about us, if he ever questioned his mother's story. My parents were absolutely smitten with their grandson. Dad would spend hours walking Alexander around the garden, pointing out different birds and plants, while Mom documented every milestone with her camera. "He's a Richmond through and through," she'd sometimes murmur, thinking I couldn't hear. But she was wrong. Alexander was a Carter, and I was determined to raise him with the strength and integrity that name represented. Work became my sanctuary. Sandra, my boss, had set up a small nursery adjacent to my office, allowing me to keep Alexander close while building our digital marketing division into one of the company's most successful departments. By his first birthday, I had earned a promotion and moved us into our own apartment, a cozy 2-bedroom with a view of the park. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were a whirlwind of baby giggles, rushed breakfasts, and dropping Alexander off at the office nursery. During lunch breaks, I'd take him to the park across the street, where he'd squeal with delight at the pigeons and squirrels. Evenings were our special time: bath, stories, and cuddles. In those moments, our little family of 2 felt complete, but the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. When Alexander was 18 months old, I received an unexpected package at work. Inside was a silver rattle, an exact replica of the one Brandon had played with as a baby. There was no note, no return address, but I knew it was from Margaret. The message was clear: she was watching us. I should have thrown it away, but instead I locked it in my desk drawer along with the journal I'd been keeping since my pregnancy. Something told me to hold on to it, to add it to my growing collection of evidence. Not that I was actively seeking justice anymore. My focus was on giving Alexander the best life possible. But deep down, I knew this story wasn't over. As Alexander grew, so did his personality. He was curious about everything, constantly asking questions and seeking adventures. By age 3, he could name every type of bird that visited our garden and recite the entire goodnight moon from memory. He was also impossibly kind, always sharing his snacks at playgroup and comforting other children when they cried. One day, while we were playing in the park, he asked the question I had been dreading. "Mommy, why don't I have a daddy like Tommy and Sarah?" Tommy and Sarah were his friends from playgroup, and they had been talking about their upcoming daddy-daughter dance. I sat him down on our favorite bench, the one under the big oak tree, and took a deep breath. "You do have a daddy, sweetheart," I said carefully. "Sometimes families are different. Some kids live with both their mommy and daddy, some just with their mommy, and some just with their daddy. Where is my daddy?" His big brown eyes, so much like Brandon's, looked up at me expectantly. "Your daddy lives far away," I said, choosing my words carefully. "But that doesn't mean you're any less loved. You have me and Grandpa and Grandma, and we love you more than all the stars in the sky." He seemed to accept this explanation, but I knew there would be more questions as he grew older. I had already started writing letters to him, explaining everything that had happened, to be given to him when he was old enough to understand. The truth was his birthright, even if it was painful. Work continued to be my anchor. By the time Alexander was 4, I had been promoted to Vice President of Digital Strategy. The promotion came with a significant raise, allowing me to move us to a better neighborhood with excellent schools. I also started a small side business consulting for startups, building a nest egg for Alexander's future. But success had its price. One evening, while leaving a client meeting downtown, I spotted Brandon. He was getting into a taxi, looking exactly as I remembered him, perhaps a bit more polished in his expensive suit. My heart didn't skip a beat like I thought it would. Instead, I felt a strange mix of pity and gratitude. Pity for what he had lost through his lack of trust, and gratitude for the life I had built without him. Alexander was thriving in his new preschool. His teacher, Ms. Reynolds, often told me how impressed she was with his vocabulary and emotional intelligence. "He's an old soul," she'd say, "always looking out for others." What she didn't know was that every night I read to him from psychology books adapted for children, teaching him about emotions and empathy. I was determined that my son would grow up understanding the importance of emotional intelligence and trust. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I received a call from the school. Alexander had fallen during recess and needed stitches. As I rushed to the emergency room, my mind racing with worry, I couldn't have known that this simple accident would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The emergency room was busy that day, and as we waited, Alexander held my hand bravely, more concerned about missing his favorite cartoon than the cut on his forehead. "Mommy," he whispered, "can we get ice cream after? The doctor might have superhero Band-Aids." Looking at him then, so brave and optimistic despite his injury, I felt a fierce surge of love and protection. What I didn't know was that fate had a surprise waiting for us, one that would force us to confront the past we had so carefully left behind. The truth about Margaret's lies was about to surface in the most unexpected way, and my little boy would play a crucial role in exposing it all. The emergency room was chaotic that afternoon. A multi-car accident had brought in several patients, and the medical staff was running between beds with urgent efficiency. Alexander sat on my lap in the waiting area, the makeshift bandage from his school nurse already soaked through. Despite the pain, he remained remarkably calm, occasionally touching the cut on his forehead with curious fingers until I gently moved his hand away. "Mrs. Carter?" a nurse finally called. As we stood up, I heard a commotion near the entrance. Through the automatic doors, paramedics were wheeling in an elderly woman on a stretcher. She was conscious but clearly in distress, clutching her chest. Behind them, looking panicked and disheveled, was Brandon, and right beside him was Margaret. My first instinct was to turn away, to protect Alexander from this unexpected collision of past and present. But before I could move, Alexander's bandage chose that moment to completely slip off, blood trickling down his forehead. He let out a small whimper, his first sign of real distress since the accident. The sound caught Brandon's attention. Our eyes met across the crowded waiting room, and I watched as his gaze shifted from me to Alexander. I saw the exact moment recognition hit him. How could it not? Alexander was his spitting image, right down to the way he furrowed his brow in pain. "Hillary." Brandon's voice was barely audible over the hospital noise, but I heard it as clearly as if he'd shouted. Margaret, distracted by her own medical emergency, hadn't noticed us yet. "Mrs. Carter?" the nurse called again, more urgently this time. "We need to get that cut looked at." I nodded, lifting Alexander into my arms. As I turned to follow the nurse, I heard quick footsteps behind us. "Please," Brandon said, his voice shaking. "What's his name? How old is he?" I hesitated, then answered quietly. "Alexander. He's 4. The math wasn't difficult." Brandon's face paled as he processed this information, his eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "The doctor is ready," the nurse interrupted, pointing us toward an examination room. As we walked away, I heard Margaret's voice calling for Brandon, followed by the sound of his retreating footsteps. The next hour was a blur of medical procedures. Alexander needed 6 stitches, and he handled them like a champion, squeezing my hand and telling the doctor about his favorite superhero, Iron Man. The doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Lewis, praised his bravery and gave him not 1 but 3 superhero band-aids to take home. As we waited for his discharge papers, a soft knock on the door made my heart skip. Brandon stood in the doorway, looking uncertain and aged somehow, despite it being only a few years since I'd last seen him. "Mom?" Alexander whispered, tugging at my sleeve. "That man looks like me." Before I could respond, Dr. Lewis returned with our paperwork. She glanced between Brandon and Alexander, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes. With professional discretion, she quickly finished her instructions about wound care and left us alone. "Hillary?" Brandon began, his voice cracking. Can we talk?" "Mommy promised ice cream," Alexander announced, unaware of the tension in the room. "Do you like ice cream?" Brandon's eyes filled with tears. "I do," he managed to say. "Chocolate's my favorite." "Mine too," Alexander beamed, touching his stitches gently. "Mommy says I'm brave, so I get extra sprinkles today." I watched this interaction with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. 5 years of anger, hurt, and protective instinct warred with the undeniable reality of seeing father and son together for the first time. "My mother," Brandon said suddenly. "She had a heart attack. They're running tests now, but..." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. A gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. "Hillary, I've been such a fool. The things she showed me that day, I should have..." "Not here," I interrupted, nodding toward Alexander, who was happily playing with his new band-aids. "Not now." Brandon nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Please," he said, placing it on the examination table. "When you're ready, I need to understand everything." As he turned to leave, Alexander called out, "Bye! I hope you get ice cream too." Brandon stopped in the doorway, his shoulders shaking slightly. Without turning around, he replied softly, "Thank you, Alexander." I hope you feel better soon." Then he was gone. In the cab ride home, after our promised ice cream stop, Alexander fell asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from the day's events. I held him close, breathing in his familiar scent mixed with antiseptic and chocolate, and thought about the business card burning a hole in my purse. That night, after tucking Alexander into bed with extra cuddles and story time, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at Brandon's card. The embossed letters showed he had made partner at his law firm. There was an email address and 2 phone numbers, office and mobile. I pulled out my old journal, the one I'd started the night of the failed wedding, and began to write. But this time, instead of documenting our story for Alexander's future understanding, I found myself composing an email to Brandon. It was time for the truth to come out. Not just for Alexander's sake, but for all of us. What I didn't know then was that in her hospital room, Margaret was having a very different kind of revelation. Faced with her own mortality, the weight of her lies had finally become too heavy to bear. As I sat writing my email, she was making a confession to her son that would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about that day 5 years ago. The next morning, as I dropped Alexander off at school, his brave little face sporting his superhero band-aids, I had no idea that both Brandon and I had spent the night uncovering different pieces of the same tragic puzzle. The truth was about to explode into the open, but not in any way I could have anticipated. My phone buzzed just as I reached my office. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hillary, it's Brandon. Mother wants to see Alexander. She's asking for him. Please. She says she needs to make things right before it's too late." I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the delete button. But then I remembered Alexander's words from the day before. "That man looks like me." He deserved to know his family, all of it, even the parts that had hurt us so deeply. The question was, could I trust Margaret's deathbed remorse? And more importantly, could I trust Brandon again? The answer would come sooner than I expected, and in a way that none of us could have predicted. Because sometimes, it takes a child's innocent heart to heal the deepest wounds, and Alexander was about to prove that love truly can triumph over lies, even if the path to truth is paved with unexpected sacrifices. I spent the entire morning staring at Brandon's text message, my finger hovering over the keyboard as I composed and deleted response after response. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was a trap, another one of Margaret's manipulations. But something in my gut told me this time was different. Perhaps it was the desperation in Brandon's voice at the hospital, or maybe it was the way Margaret had looked on that stretcher. Vulnerable, human, stripped of her usual armor of superiority. Finally, around noon I wrote back, "I need to speak with you first. Alone. Tonight, after Alexander is asleep. My parents can watch him." His response was immediate. "Thank you. Name the place and time." We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near my apartment at 8 p.m. It was neutral territory, public enough to feel safe but quiet enough for the conversation we needed to have. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, going through the motions at work while my mind raced with all the things I needed to say. That evening, as I tucked Alexander into bed, he asked about the man from the hospital again. "Mommy, why did that man cry when he saw me?" I sat on the edge of his bed, running my fingers through his dark curls, so like his father's. "Sometimes, sweetheart, grown-ups cry when they're surprised by something beautiful." "Was he surprised by my superhero band-aids?" he asked innocently. "Something like that," I whispered, kissing his forehead carefully around the stitches. "Sweet dreams, my brave boy." The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. Brandon was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of him. He stood when he saw me, and I noticed he'd loosened his tie, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. "I remembered how you take your coffee," he said quietly. "Vanilla latte with an extra shot." I sat down, wrapping my hands around the warm cup but not drinking. "Why now, Brandon? After 5 years, why does she suddenly want to see him?" He ran a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture again. "She's dying, Hillary. The heart attack was worse than we initially thought. There's extensive damage, and she's refusing bypass surgery. She says—" He paused, his voice breaking slightly. She says she doesn't deserve to live with what she's done. What exactly has she told you? I asked, my heart pounding. Everything. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. She wrote this confession last night. I had it notarized this morning. She detailed exactly how she fabricated those documents, how she paid a lab technician to create false paternity test results, how she— He stopped, his hands shaking. How she orchestrated the entire thing because she thought you were taking me away from her. She was convinced I would move to New York for your career, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing me. I felt the room spin slightly. After 5 years of carrying the weight of those lies, hearing the truth spoken aloud was almost too much to bear. And you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What do you think now? I think I've been the biggest fool in the world, he replied, his eyes filling with tears. I think I threw away everything that mattered because I was too weak to stand up to her, too afraid to trust my heart over her lies. I think— He reached across the table, not quite touching my hand. I think I've missed 5 years of my son's life, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Alexander, I said firmly. His name is Alexander James Carter, and he's the most amazing little boy you could imagine. He loves chocolate ice cream and superhero stories. He can name every bird in the park, and he always shares his snacks with other kids. He's kind and brave and smart, and I've done everything in my power to protect him from the pain you and your mother caused. Brandon withdrew his hand, nodding slowly. You've done an incredible job with him. I saw that yesterday. He's perfect. He's not perfect, I corrected. He's real. He's a little boy who sometimes asks about his daddy, who deserves to know where he comes from, but who also deserves to be protected from anyone who might hurt him, emotionally or otherwise. I want to make this right, Brandon said. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but he does. He deserves to know his family, even the broken parts of it. And my mother, Hillary, she's not the same person who hurt you. The guilt has been eating away at her for years. Finding out she might die without ever meeting her grandson, without making amends, it broke something in her. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of Alexander on his first day of preschool, beaming at the camera with his Batman backpack. This is what you're asking me to risk, I said. This happiness, this innocence. Your mother already took so much from us. How can I trust her with him? Brandon stared at the photo, tears rolling down his cheeks. Because she's not asking for forgiveness, he said quietly. She just wants to meet him once, to tell him the truth herself, in whatever way is appropriate for a child his age. She wants him to know that none of it was your fault, that his father was a coward, and his grandmother was wrong. She wants to give him the truth before she dies. I took a sip of my now cold coffee, thinking about the journal I'd been keeping all these years. I have conditions, I said finally. Non-negotiable ones. Brandon straightened up, wiping his eyes. Anything. First, I need to meet with her alone before she sees Alexander. I need to look her in the eye and hear this confession myself. Second, if, and it's a big if, I allow her to meet him, it will be on my terms, in my presence, and I can end it at any moment if I feel it's not in his best interest. Of course, Brandon nodded. And third, I continued, my voice firm, you need to understand that while Alexander deserves to know his father, trust has to be earned. If you want to be in his life, it has to be completely. No disappearing when things get hard, no letting your mother manipulate situations again. He's not a prop for anyone's redemption story. He's a little boy who needs stability and love. I understand, Brandon said solemnly. I'll do whatever it takes. I've already started therapy, trying to understand how I let my mother control me for so long, how I could have doubted you so easily. I know I have a lot of work to do. As we sat there in that quiet coffee shop, the weight of 5 years of pain and secrets hanging between us, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother with a photo of Alexander sleeping, his stuffed penguin clutched tight in his arms. Looking at his peaceful face, I made my decision. Tomorrow, I said, putting my phone away. I'll meet with her tomorrow. But Brandon? I caught his eye. If this is another manipulation, if she hurts him in any way? It's not, he interrupted. And I won't let her. Not this time. I promise. What I didn't know then was that Margaret's confession was just the beginning. The next 24 hours would bring revelations that would shake us all to our core, and Alexander would play a role that none of us could have anticipated. Sometimes the path to healing comes from the most unexpected directions, and sometimes it takes a child's pure heart to show adults the way back to truth and forgiveness. The hospital corridor seemed endless as I walked toward Margaret's room the next morning. Each step felt heavier than the last, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anxiety. I'd left Alexander at school, telling him I had an important meeting. His goodbye hug had given me strength, but now, standing outside room 415, I felt that strength wavering. Through the door's window, I could see Margaret propped up in bed, looking smaller and frailer than I remembered. Gone was the impeccably dressed woman who had destroyed my wedding day. In her place was an elderly patient, connected to monitors and IV lines, her silver hair limp against the pillow. "Come in, Hillary," she called out weakly, having noticed me through the window. "Please." I entered the room, staying near the door. The beeping of her heart monitor filled the silence between us. Finally, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "You look well," she said. "Motherhood suits you." "Let's not do this, Margaret," I replied firmly. "No small talk, no pleasantries. You wanted to see me before meeting Alexander. I'm here. Talk." She closed her eyes briefly, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. "You're right, of course. Always so direct, so honest. Everything I should have been." She reached for a manila envelope on her bedside table, her hands shaking. "Everything is in here. The original documents I altered, receipts from the lab technician I bribed, emails arranging the whole horrible plan. But more importantly," she pulled out a handwritten letter. "This is my full confession." I took the envelope but didn't open it. "Why?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for 5 years finally escaping my lips. "Why did you do it?" "Because I was terrified of losing Brandon," she whispered. "When he met you, everything changed. He started talking about moving to New York for your career, about starting a fresh life away from Boston, away from me. Then you got pregnant and She paused, her monitor showing a spike in her heart rate. "I convinced myself you were trapping him, that you'd take him away forever. I became obsessed with preventing that. So you destroyed us both instead," I said, my voice cold. "You didn't just hurt me, Margaret. You hurt your own son. You deprived your grandson of his father." "I know," she sobbed. "When Brandon told me about seeing you and Alexander in the ER, seeing his own face in that little boy's... Hillary, I've been dying inside for years with this guilt. But that moment, knowing what I'd done to my own grandchild..." Suddenly, her monitor started beeping rapidly. A nurse rushed in, checking her vitals and giving me a concerned look. "Mrs. Richmond needs to stay calm," she warned. I waited until the nurse left before speaking again. "You want to meet Alexander. Why should I allow that?" Margaret took several deep breaths before answering. "Because he deserves to know the truth, and because I'm dying. The doctors say without surgery I have weeks at most. Even with it, my chances are poor. I've refused the surgery because I need to do this first. I need to make things right." "And how exactly do you plan to make 5 years of lies right?" I challenged. "I don't," she replied simply. "I can't. But I can give him something precious. The truth about his parents' love story, about how my lies tore it apart, and about how none of it was ever his mother's fault. He needs to know that his father didn't abandon him willingly, that his mother protected him fiercely, and that his grandmother..." Her voice broke. "That his grandmother made a terrible mistake out of fear and selfish love." I sat down in the chair beside her bed, finally opening the envelope. As I read through the documents, the elaborate web of lies she had woven became clear. The sophistication of her deception was staggering. Altered medical records, fabricated photographs, even a fake witness statement about my supposed infidelity. "Does Brandon know all of this?" I asked, holding up the evidence of her manipulation. "Yes," she nodded. "I told him everything yesterday. Hillary, I've never seen my son so angry, so devastated. He barely spoke 2 words to me after I finished. Just sat there, staring at the wall, tears running down his face. Then he got up and left. He came back this morning only to tell me he's started therapy to deal with how I've controlled his life. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Brandon stood there, looking exhausted, like he hadn't slept. Our eyes met, and I saw the same pain and confusion I'd felt for years reflected in his gaze. "Hillary," he said softly, "there's something else you need to see." He walked over and handed me his phone, open to an email. I found this in Mother's personal email account last night. She gave me access to everything. As I read the email, my hands began to shake. It was dated just 2 weeks after our wedding day, from the lab technician Margaret had bribed. He was demanding more money to keep quiet, threatening to expose the truth. Margaret had paid him off again, and again 6 months later, and again after that. "The technician," Brandon explained, his voice tight with anger, "died in a car accident 3 years ago. That's why Mother felt safe keeping these emails. She never thought they'd come to light." I looked up at Margaret, who had turned her face away in shame. "You paid to keep your lies hidden over and over while I suffered, while your son suffered, while your grandson grew up without his father." "I was a coward," she whispered. Each time I thought about confessing, the fear of losing Brandon's love forever stopped me. But now, she gestured to the hospital room around her. "Now I have nothing left to lose, and everything to atone for." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Alexander's school. My heart stopped as I read it. Alexander had fallen again during recess, reopening his stitches. They were taking him to the same ER where we'd been 2 days ago. I stood up quickly, gathering my things. "I have to go. Alexander's hurt." "What happened?" Brandon asked, alarmed. "Is he okay?" "He needs new stitches," I explained, already heading for the door. "I have to get to the ER." "Hillary? Wait," Margaret called out weakly. "Please, will you still consider letting me meet him? Even after everything you've just learned?" I paused at the door, looking back at the frail woman who had caused so much pain, and at Brandon, who looked torn between following me and staying with his mother. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Right now, my son needs me. That's all I can focus on." As I hurried toward the elevator, I heard footsteps behind me. Brandon had followed. "Let me drive you," he offered. "Please. He's my son too, even if I haven't earned the right to call myself his father yet." Looking at his worried face, seeing Alexander's features reflected in his expression, I made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Okay," I nodded. "But understand this. We're going because Alexander needs medical care. This doesn't change anything about what I just learned." What I didn't know then was that this second emergency room visit would lead to a moment of truth none of us could have anticipated, and Alexander would teach us all something profound about forgiveness and the healing power of a child's heart. The drive to the emergency room was tense, with Brandon gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. I kept checking my phone for updates from the school, my heart racing every time I thought about Alexander being hurt. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sharing this parental moment of worry with a man who'd missed 1,000 others. "He's allergic to penicillin," I said suddenly, breaking the silence. "If they need to give him antibiotics, I'll make sure they know," Brandon assured me, his voice tight with concern. At that moment, he wasn't the man who'd abandoned us at the altar. He was just a father worried about his son. We found Alexander in the pediatric ER, sitting on an examination table with his teacher, Ms. Reynolds, beside him. His previous stitches had indeed come loose, and blood had stained his favorite Spider-Man t-shirt. But instead of crying, he was animatedly telling the nurse about how he'd been trying to save a younger student's ball from the bushes when he fell. "Mommy!" he called out when he saw me, then his eyes widened. "Look, the man who looks like me is here too." Brandon froze in the doorway, emotion raw on his face. The nurse looked between them, clearly noting the resemblance, then tactfully excused herself to get the doctor. Ms. Reynolds, sensing the delicate situation, patted Alexander's hand and said she'd check on him later. "Does your head hurt, sweetheart?" I asked, examining the reopened cut. "Not much," Alexander replied bravely, then turned to Brandon. "Did you get ice cream after you left last time? I got chocolate with extra sprinkles because I was brave." Brandon stepped closer, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't get ice cream. I guess I wasn't as brave as you. That's okay, Alexander said with the simple wisdom of a child. You can be brave next time. Dr. Lewis arrived then, the same doctor who had treated Alexander 2 days ago. She took in the scene, including Brandon's presence, with professional composure. Well, young man, looks like you wanted to see us again. Let's fix those stitches, shall we? Will it hurt? Alexander asked, gripping my hand. A little, Dr. Lewis admitted. But I think you've got plenty of support here to help you through it. As she prepared the local anesthetic, Alexander looked at Brandon. Can you hold my other hand? Mommy says it helps to squeeze someone's hand when you're scared. Brandon glanced at me, asking permission with his eyes. I nodded slightly, and he moved to Alexander's other side, offering his hand. Our son took it without hesitation, and for the first time in 5 years, we were connected through our child's touch. You're doing great, buddy, Brandon encouraged as Dr. Lewis began working on the stitches. Just squeeze our hands as hard as you need to. You know what's funny? Alexander said, wincing slightly, but maintaining his brave face. Your hands feel just like mine. Look! He held up his free hand, comparing it to Brandon's larger one. Same lines and everything. I saw tears forming in Brandon's eyes as he looked at their matching hands. Yeah, he managed to say. That is funny. Mommy, Alexander said thoughtfully as Dr. Lewis continued her work. Remember when you said some kids have their daddy far away? Is he my daddy? Is that why we look the same? The room went still. Tart. Lewis kept working professionally, but I could tell she was moving as quietly as possible, respecting the gravity of the moment. I took a deep breath, knowing this wasn't how I'd planned this conversation. But sometimes life doesn't wait for perfect moments. Yes, sweetheart, I answered softly. He is your daddy. Alexander processed this information with remarkable calmness. Where were you? He asked Brandon directly. No accusation in his voice, just pure curiosity. Brandon's voice shook as he answered, I made a very big mistake, Alexander. I listened to someone who told me lies instead of trusting your mommy, who always tells the truth. I missed watching you grow up, and that will be my biggest regret for the rest of my life. Did you say sorry? Alexander asked, with all the simplicity of a child's logic. Not enough, Brandon replied honestly. Not nearly enough. When I make a mistake, Alexander said wisely, Mommy says what matters most is learning from it and trying to do better next time. He squeezed Brandon's hand. Are you trying to do better? Yes, Brandon whispered, tears now flowing freely down his face. Yes, I'm trying very hard to do better. All done, Dr. Lewis announced, applying the last butterfly bandage. And I think these stitches will hold better than the last ones. Just no more rescue missions in the bushes for a while, okay? Alexander nodded solemnly, then turned back to Brandon. Do you like Spider-Man? He asked, pointing to his stained t-shirt. I do, Brandon replied, wiping his eyes. I have all the movies. Really? Alexander's eyes lit up. Mommy only lets me watch the cartoon ones because she says the movies are too scary for kids my age. Your mommy's right, Brandon said, catching my eye. She's very smart about taking care of you. Just then, my phone rang. It was the hospital's main number. Margaret had taken a turn for the worse, and they needed Brandon to return immediately. I watched the conflict play across his face, wanting to stay with his newly acknowledged son, but knowing his mother needed him. Go, I said softly. She's still your mother. But Alexander, Daddy has to go help his mommy. I explained to Alexander, the word daddy feeling strange on my tongue. She's very sick in the hospital. Alexander's face grew serious. Like when you took care of me when I had the flu, he asked me. Something like that, I nodded. You should go help her, Alexander told Brandon firmly. Mommies need us when they're sick. Brandon knelt down to Alexander's level. Thank you for being so understanding. And thank you for letting me hold your hand today. It meant more to me than you'll ever know. Will I see you again? Alexander asked. Brandon looked at me, the question clear in his eyes. I thought about everything that had happened in the past few days. Margaret's confession, the evidence of her deception, and most importantly, the natural connection I'd just witnessed between father and son. Why don't we all get ice cream tomorrow? I suggested. After school? Alexander's face lit up. With extra sprinkles? With extra sprinkles, Brandon confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. I promise. As Brandon hurried away to check on his mother, I helped Alexander change into the spare shirt I kept in my bag. He was unusually quiet as I gathered our things to leave. Mommy? He said finally. Is Daddy's mommy very sick? Yes, sweetheart, she is. Can we make her a get-well card? Like the one I made for Ms. Reynolds when she had a cold? I stared at my son, amazed by his capacity for kindness, even toward people he'd never met. In that moment, I realized that perhaps Alexander's innocent heart could heal more than just his own wounds. Maybe it could help heal our broken family too. What I didn't know then was that Margaret's condition was worse than anyone had realized, and the next 24 hours would bring challenges that would test our newfound fragile peace in ways none of us could have anticipated. Sometimes the path to forgiveness comes at a higher price than we expect, and sometimes it's our children who show us the way to pay it. That evening, after Alexander was asleep, I sat at my kitchen table making a get-well card with him for Margaret. He had insisted on using his special glitter markers, carefully drawing what he called a family of birds. A big bird, a medium bird, and a tiny bird, all holding wings. Because birds stay together, he'd explained before bedtime. Like families should. My phone lit up with a text from Brandon. Mother's taken a severe turn. Doctors say without surgery immediately she won't make it through the night. She's still refusing. Can I come over? Need to talk. 20 minutes later, Brandon sat across from me at the same kitchen table, looking at Alexander's half-finished card. His eyes were red-rimmed, his tie loose around his neck. She won't listen to reason, he said, running his fingers over the glittery birds. She says she doesn't deserve to live after what she did to us, that she needs to pay for her sins. He looked up at me, desperate. Hillary, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but what do the doctors say about her chances with surgery? 50-50. Without it, 0. She keeps saying she needs to see Alexander first to apologize to him face to face. But there's no time. The doctors say if we wait until morning. He didn't finish the sentence. I closed my eyes, thinking about the manila envelope full of evidence of Margaret's deception, about the years of pain she'd caused. But I also thought about Alexander's words. Mommies need us when they're sick. Wake him up, I said finally. But Brandon, if we do this, it's not for her. It's for Alexander, so he never has to wonder if he could have helped save his grandmother. Brandon nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. 10 minutes later, I carried a sleepy Alexander into the hospital, his favorite stuffed penguin tucked under one arm, the unfinished get-well card clutched in his other hand. Margaret's room was dimly lit, machines beeping steadily around her. She looked even smaller than she had that morning, her skin almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights. Her eyes widened when she saw us enter. Alexander? She whispered, tears immediately flowing down her cheeks. Are you Daddy's mommy? Alexander asked, suddenly shy and pressing closer to me. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Brandon moved to her bedside, taking her hand. Mother, Alexander and Hillary are here. Now will you agree to the surgery? Margaret's eyes never left Alexander's face. I made you a card, he said, holding out his artwork. But it's not finished yet. I need to add more glitter. It's beautiful, she managed to say, her voice breaking. The birds, their family? Alexander nodded seriously. The big bird is Daddy, the medium bird is Mommy, and the little bird is me. See? They're holding wings because Mommy says family should stick together, even when things are hard. I saw something crack in Margaret's expression. She looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in 5 years. Hillary, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't deserve this kindness. No, I agreed quietly. You don't. But Alexander deserves to have a grandmother, if you're brave enough to be one. I want to add another bird, Alexander announced, unaware of the weight of the moment. A grandma bird. But you have to get better first so you can help me pick the right color. Margaret's monitor showed her heart rate increasing. A nurse poked her head in, concerned, but Margaret waved her away. Alexander, she said, struggling to sit up straighter. I need to tell you something important. A long time ago, I did something very wrong. I told lies that hurt your mommy and daddy very much. Did you say sorry? Alexander asked, echoing the same question he'd asked Brandon earlier. Not enough, Margaret answered, unconsciously echoing Brandon's earlier response. Not nearly enough. When I lie, Alexander said thoughtfully, Mommy makes me sit in the thinking chair until I'm ready to tell the truth and say sorry. Maybe you need a thinking chair too? A strange sound escaped Margaret's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. Yes, she said. Yes, I think I do. But first, she turned to Brandon. Call the doctor. I'll have the surgery. The next few hours were a blur of activity. As they prepared Margaret for emergency surgery, Alexander fell asleep in my arms in the waiting room, his penguin tucked under his chin. Brandon sat beside us, occasionally reaching out to smooth our son's hair. Hillary, he said softly, careful not to wake Alexander. Thank you for bringing him, for giving her a chance, for everything. I didn't do it for her, I reminded him. I know. That's what makes it even more remarkable. He paused, watching Alexander sleep. He's so much like you, you know. Your kindness, your wisdom. I see it in everything he does. He has your smile, I said without thinking, and your heart, when it's not being clouded by fear or doubt. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Alexander woke up a few times, asked for water, then drifted back to sleep. Around dawn, the doctor finally emerged, looking tired but satisfied. She made it through, he announced. The next 24 hours will be critical, but she's fighting. Whatever happened tonight, it gave her the will to live. Looking down at our sleeping son, I knew exactly what, or rather who, had given Margaret that will to live. Alexander had done what neither Brandon nor I could do. He had offered unconditional forgiveness, the kind that only a child's pure heart can give. As the sun rose over Boston, painting the hospital windows with golden light, I realized we were at a crossroads. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There were years of hurt to process, trust to rebuild, and relationships to redefine. But watching Alexander sleep peacefully between Brandon and me, his unfinished card still clutched in his hand, I knew that healing was possible. What I couldn't have known then was that Margaret's recovery would bring even more surprises, and that Alexander's simple wisdom would continue to guide us all toward a future none of us could have imagined on that terrible wedding day 5 years ago. Sometimes the greatest lessons about love and forgiveness come from those who have the least reason to understand either, our children. 6 months after Margaret's surgery, I stood in my kitchen watching Alexander put the finishing touches on yet another card. This one wasn't made with glitter markers, but with careful pencil strokes and his best attempt at cursive writing. Dear Grandma, it read, I'm glad you're feeling better. Love, Alexander. The past months had been a journey of careful steps and gradual healing. Margaret's physical recovery had been mirrored by something deeper, a transformation that none of us had expected. The woman who emerged from that hospital room was different from the one who had orchestrated our destruction 5 years ago. She attended therapy 3 times a week, working through her controlling behavior and fear of abandonment. She insisted on paying for Alexander's private school education, not as a way to buy forgiveness, but as a small step toward making amends. When I initially refused, she said something that changed my mind. Let me do this not as his grandmother, but as someone trying to repair a fraction of the damage I've done. Brandon and I were on our own journey of reconciliation. We started with supervised visits, ice cream after school, weekend trips to the park, and eventually Sunday dinners at my parents' house. Alexander thrived on these moments, soaking up his father's attention like a flower turning toward the sun. One particularly memorable Sunday, my father pulled Brandon aside for what I thought would be a confrontation. Instead, I overheard him say, Everyone deserves a second chance when they're truly sorry, but if you ever hurt them again... He didn't need to finish the threat. Brandon understood. The real breakthrough came during Alexander's first school play. He was cast as a wise old owl in a forest fable, and he insisted everyone had to attend. Mommy, Daddy, both sets of grandparents. It could have been awkward, but watching him on stage, delivering his lines with such earnest concentration, We all found ourselves united in our pride and love for this remarkable little boy. After the play, Margaret approached me while Brandon was helping Alexander out of his owl costume. "Hillary," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I've been writing something for you. A complete account of everything I did, every manipulation, every lie. Not for publication or exposure, but for healing. Would you be willing to read it?" I looked at her, really looked at her. The proud, controlling woman who had once terrorized my life was gone. In her place was someone humbled by her own actions, someone actively working to be better. "Yes," I said. "I think I'm ready." That night, after Alexander was asleep, I read Margaret's confession. It was brutal in its honesty, detailing not just her actions, but her thought processes, her jealousies, her fears. She wrote about how watching Alexander's unconditional love had taught her what real family meant, not control or possession, but acceptance and support. Weeks turned into months. Brandon and I continued to co-parent, our relationship evolving into something new, not the romantic love we'd once shared, but a deep partnership based on our mutual devotion to Alexander. We learned to trust each other again, not as lovers, but as parents. Margaret's transformation continued to surprise us all. She volunteered at a women's shelter, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of control and manipulation. She never asked for forgiveness directly, but showed it through her actions, supporting my career decisions, respecting boundaries, and most importantly, loving Alexander without trying to control his affections. Then came the day that brought everything full circle. Alexander's 5th birthday party was in full swing in our backyard. Children ran around playing games, parents chatted, and in the midst of it all, my son stood surrounded by both sides of his family, the Carters and the Richmonds, together at last. As we sang "Happy Birthday," I caught sight of something that made my heart skip. Alexander was holding hands with both Brandon and me as he prepared to blow out his candles. The photo my mother captured of that moment now sits on my desk. Our son, grinning with chocolate frosting on his chin, flanked by his parents who had found their way back to being a family, if not a couple. "Make a wish, sweetheart," I encouraged as he took a deep breath. "I don't need to," he announced proudly. "I already got what I wanted. My family's all here." Margaret, standing nearby, wiped tears from her eyes. The birds from his get well card had been framed and hung in her living room, now with 4 birds, all holding wings, all flying together. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Brandon helped me clean up while Alexander showed Margaret his new toys. "We did it," Brandon said quietly, gathering paper plates. "Not the way we planned, but we did it. We're a family." "We are," I agreed. "Just not the traditional kind. Maybe that's better," he suggested. "We had to earn this version." Looking at Alexander, who was demonstrating his new magic kit for his grandmother with absolute concentration, I understood something profound. Sometimes the families we build from the ashes of our mistakes are stronger than the ones we originally planned. Our son had taught us that love doesn't have to look like a fairy tale to be real and meaningful. The story of how my wedding day turned into a nightmare will always be part of our history, but it's no longer the defining chapter. Instead, it's become the beginning of a different story, one about redemption, growth, and the pure wisdom of a child who taught 3 generations how to love without conditions or fears. As the sun set on Alexander's birthday party, he gathered us all for one more photo. "Stand together," he directed, arranging us just so, like the birds in my picture. And there we were, his father, his grandmother, his mother, and him in the middle, holding us all together with the simple, powerful love that had healed our broken family, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through small acts of kindness, through daily choices to be better, and through the unwavering belief that family, in whatever form it takes, is worth fighting for. That night, as I tucked Alexander into bed surrounded by his new toys, he asked me a question that showed just how much he understood. "Mommy, are you still mad at Daddy and Grandma?" "No, sweetheart," I answered honestly. "I'm not mad anymore. They made mistakes, but they worked very hard to fix them. Just like you do when you make mistakes, remember?" He nodded sagely. And now we're like my birds, all flying together? Yes, I smiled, kissing his forehead. We're all flying together now. As I turned out his light, I realized that the happily ever after I'd dreamed of on my wedding day had come true after all, just not in the way I'd expected. Our story hadn't ended with a perfect wedding. Instead, it had begun with a broken one, and through the pure heart of a child, had transformed into something far more precious, a family built on forgiveness, understanding, and unconditional love.